it's not so ridiculous. But what the hell were we talking about before we lost the internet?
Just the process of when a foreign government accumulates the U.S. Treasury bonds, what that means to the U.S. That's it's not foreign indebtedness, which is when a country borrows foreign currency to jumpstart their economy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's rather the opposite. It's U.S. Currency nominated securities that a foreign government buys because they have dollars, because they've exported to our country. They've accumulated dollars on their bank, and they want to invest those in some interest-bearing secure securities. So that's all there is to it, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody asked us, doesn't China buying U.S. bonds weaken their currency, allowing Americans to purchase more Chinese goods, therefore creating employment in China, or what Trump called currency manipulation? Uh, so basically, the process of buying the bonds itself doesn't change the currency because there's no currency transaction involved. It's just the Chinese entities have accumulated dollars, and then they use those dollars. They replace those dollars with the treasury securities. But what does lead to currency manipulation is if the central bank offers Chinese currency below a value that the market would pay for it. So if the Chinese government goes out and just starts buying up US dollars with their currency, then that would be currency manipulation. That would lead to their currency coming down in value.
Because they're selling a bunch of yuan to buy dollars. They're creating yuan, selling it on the market to buy dollars, right?
They're creating yuan to buy dollars. That would weaken their currency and make their exports cheaper to foreigners. The thing with the Chinese currency, it's been kind of fixed for a long time. I think it just recently started moving out of those long time bands, but that could be considered a currency devaluation if you think that the market value of the currency would have otherwise gone up over the years, which is not unreasonable to assume, because that's what happens when a country exports a lot. That their currency actually gains in value, so that that they can now import more goods for the same price than they previously could, and that would then over time tend to balance out the balance of trade. So that if you keep that process from occurring by selling Chinese currency into the system, buying up US dollars, then instead of the Chinese currency going up in value, it stays at the same level, which could be considered a form of devaluation of the currency.
Right, but I think to call it manipulation makes it sound like they're doing something nefarious, which, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not nefarious, but it sounds like they're doing something against the rule book. Right, like there's some international rule book that you're supposed to follow in terms of dealing with foreign nations. And if you've got a central bank that can print currency, and you have a national policy that says we want cheap currency in order to encourage exports, then I don't really see why they shouldn't do that if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, if the goal is for the government of the country to achieve full employment and maximum prosperity within their borders, MMT suggests that you shouldn't do that. MMT
Right.
suggests that you should have a free-floating currency and that you shouldn't manipulate the foreign exchange value of the currency. But then there are people who might disagree with that. Who would those people be who disagree with, well, I want our currency to be weak. So who are the people who would want the Chinese currency to be weaker? Well, it would be Chinese export conglomerates.
Yeah.
It would be Chinese export lobbyists, and that's usually the case traditionally. That's what happens. Export lobbyists, they push for their own treasury and their own central bank to have a policy that makes your currency weaker, because they don't earn money in that currency. They primarily earn money in foreign currency, which they want to see more valuable.
Right.
So it's a pure
Political.
selfish
Yeah.
political economic motivation that is then reflected if they're successful in their lobbying work, and if they are successful reaching powerful people, maybe giving them a cut, etc. Then yeah, that's what happens.
Well, and then to add to that, let's say you're the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and you say, well, our national platform is to industrialize as rapidly as possible and take all these peasants out in the farms and get them in the cities and working in industrial capacity. Well, I guess the fastest way to do that is if the whole rest of the world is buying shit from our industry. Right, so we want to export like crazy. So I mean, whether or not that's a good or a bad idea,
some sort of a political calculus there, certainly.
Yeah.
We have here like just long-term sort of.
Well, that's interesting. That flat bar, yeah.
Yeah. So we in 2005, this is the yuan versus, this is the US dollar to Chinese yuan. So $1 buys 6 yuan 78
yuan cents,
right?
whatever they're called.
Yeah, so $1 is worth about 6 yuan, 7 yuans, and until 2005, $1 was actually worth 8 yuan. So the dollar has become less valuable. So the yuan has actually increased in value over these.
Well, and then it looks like prior to 2005, they must have fixed the yuan value to the dollar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fixed at this level, 8.2. Then they changed the fix to 6.83, which was then 2008, so post-financial crisis. So they actually revalued the yuan after 2005, and they made it more valuable against the US dollar. So here we have $1 US only buys you 6 yuan 80, and that's been sort of, it's now back at that level again. It actually, then after 2010 it went down, that the lowest point was 6.05 in 2014. So once again the dollar lost value against the yuan.
Mm-hmm.
It hit the low point in 2014. And since then, it's come back up.
Either since then it's been more free floating, or they've gotten more dynamic with whatever the heck it is they want to do to their currency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It certainly does look like it's more free floating, because you don't see these completely stable periods like we've had before.
Right. To bring this back to home, because we originally talked about the debt ceiling and how it's totally nonsense. I think China was a good example of, breaking down the myths of like, oh my God, China's got they can call on this debt and totally screw us up, and that's all just nonsense. It's just complete and utter nonsense. And Nima, do you mind pulling up that Tim Pool clip that I sent you? Because I saw this morning. This was a small clip from Tim Pool. Tim Pool had Matt Gaetz on the show. Yeah, it's really what got my brain cranking on this. Go ahead and play it.
You mentioned the debt ceiling a little.
Oh wait, can you hear it? Let me see if
I can hear it.
Okay.
I mean, I
presume
that makes it to the stream.
Actually, let me share my screen one more time just to make sure, because I know there's a setting here. Yeah, I didn't have it checked, so it shouldn't have. So you heard it through the microphone, probably.
You mentioned the debt ceiling a little bit ago. You guys are about to vote on a debt ceiling
in the next 4 months.
So my whole life I've been watching them incrementally raise the debt ceiling over and over and over. And the thing is, it's from my point of view, it's supposed to be a ceiling that you don't print more money than that, because that's the ceiling. So can we make a realistic debt ceiling of 1.4 quadrillion? Just say we're gonna get there eventually. We can survive this amount. We're gonna print another $7,000 trillion. Because I think we are going to. I don't know. Do you think maybe we won't? What do you think about that idea? Is that just too far out? What are you in?
Well, you're right that it's a joke because there is no real plan to ensure that we have a cap on that which we will borrow and spend. And I think the reason this continues to get worse on the books is because like regular Americans don't feel the pain of the national debt in a proximate way. Like,
So there are so many errors in assumption happening in that 1 minute clip. I cannot even know where to start. But I think I want to start with the fact that the right, in quotes, the right, typically throughout U.S. history has been the instigator and the pushers for, in quotes, sound money and fiscal or financial responsibility. And as we pointed out earlier in the show, the rules for government, federal government specifically, are different from the rules for everybody else. And so what this guy apparently on Tim Pool's team brought up is that he doesn't say this specifically, but I can tell he's coming from this assumption that, oh my God, we got to stop borrowing so much money. And Matt Gaetz confirms that, where he's like, yeah, we got to get this borrowing under control and stop spending so much money, because if we keep, the idea being if we borrow too much, at some point we're not going to be able to service the debt of so much money that we borrowed. But as we pointed out, I guess we didn't say this explicitly, I'll say it explicitly now, the government can't borrow in its own currency. It is logically impossible.
Yeah, it must be created by them first before anything can be done with it.
Right? So, and again, the debt ceiling doesn't exist in any other country. No other country even worries about this thing called a debt ceiling. And when you mix in the fact, let's bring in another element here, that our current taxation system at the federal level is primarily, in quotes, funded. I put that in quotes for a reason that maybe we'll get to in a minute, by income taxes. Taxes on income. And now I know there's self-employment or FICA taxes, which is for Social Security and Medicare, but that's still a tax on income, right? So the way that our system is set up to generate tax revenue for the federal government is the more economic activity that happens, which is a way to saying the better that the economy gets, the more the taxes flow into the government. Right? So, if Nima's got $100 and I work for Nima and I earn that $100, well, 20 of those dollars goes to the government. Now I have 80. Now Nima wants to work for me and for $80 and I pay him $80 and 16 of those dollars goes to the government. And if we keep working back and forth with each other, we're going to have less and less and less money in the private sector because it's going to keep going to the government. So we actually have a system here in the United States where if the government doesn't keep expanding the deficit, it will tax more money out of the system than it's putting in, and it will starve the private sector for the money that it needs in order to do economic activity. I mean, this is the thing that I think will makes people's heads explode, which is to say, if the government doesn't spend more than it's taxing, the private sector economy won't have enough liquidity to operate.
Yeah, the private sector economy will move into a more and more speculative financing stage, basically, because the federal government deficit provides a component of the income of the private sector that comes with no strings attached, and that's very safe and secure. And the more the private sector goes into debt with the banks, the more shaky the foundation becomes, because those debts, they do have to find the money to repay them back. So we found that throughout history, as long as there's a correlation between increasing debt levels of the private sector, increasing private debt levels, and an increasing federal government deficit, then there's enough income to support the debt levels, the private debt levels. But if the federal government moves towards a balanced budget or even a surplus, then that kind of pulls the rug from underneath the private sector. And at one point, we reach a speculative, we reach a Ponzi stage of financing, which is very risky, and it's just some news that are not stellar and excellent can cause all kinds of havoc in the private sector.
Right. Well, and then just to kind of look at that math briefly, the things that people are typically worried about with the debt ceiling getting too high, not being able to service the debt, like you just said, actually applies to the banking system, right? Because if the banking system loans out $100 and they have to collect 110 in interest, well, the people who get lent out that money have to scramble around and pay the money back.
Well, that's what we find historically. If the federal government deficit goes towards a balanced budget or a surplus, the private sector starts going into debt to the private banks, and that debt is actually a problematic debt for the private sector.
Well, and then in order for the private sector to keep going, they have to borrow more to pay the previous debt, which increases the amount of debt owed. So they have to borrow more to pay the previous debt, and as you said, any little bump collapses the whole tower of.
Right,
so
because these are the stages of financing that Hyman Minsky has identified, which is the safest stage is a hedge, where all your principal payments and your interest payments are covered by your expected income. Then you move on as things go well. This is also one of Minsky's central hypotheses. If things go well, people become more foolish. They become less risk averse, right? So then we move from the hedge stage to the speculative stage, in which only the interest is covered by expected earnings, but not necessarily the principal payments. So principal payments fall behind, and the debt load stays the same or increases at the end of the day. And then we move from that stage into the worst, which is the Ponzi stage, which is where expected income doesn't even cover interest payments, and borrowers now need to borrow more just to be able to make the interest payments. And that is a very shaky stage of financing, which the economies find themselves in during the end of their boom phase, the credit boom phase. And then what comes afterwards is unless the federal government steps in and makes up for the shortfall, the neglect in providing enough net private savings to the private sector, then now the private sector will be forced to cut back. Companies can't expand anymore because they can't even pay they can't even pay the interest on the debts that they borrowed. So they have to write those off. So investment falls off, and people have to be laid off, and those people don't earn money. And then they start consuming less, and then companies sell fewer products.
Downward spiral.
So, it turns into a spiral. And it needs to be backstopped by the federal government at some point. Otherwise, people are just going to be in debt to the federal government at the end of the day. The whole private sector, if you follow this through, at the end of the day, the whole private sector is going to be in debt to the federal government, and everything's owned by the federal government. That would be the final conclusion of letting
because there's more taxes owed than money available.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Letting the invisible hand figure it all out. So that was just a little detour about Minsky's.
Well, and then I think you brought up a really interesting point, and this freaks out the invisible hand proponents, is that the federal government has to provide injection into the system in order to prevent the Ponzi scheme from collapsing. Right? And that's not, I'm not saying that the system is a Ponzi scheme. I'm saying it turns into one if there's not enough private sector net savings to buoy the private debt that's being created through the, in quotes, private sector banking system. Now, I want to bring this back to something I said right at the beginning, which is that this whole debt ceiling thing creates a fight between the right and the left, both at the political level and at the you and me level, of arguing on fucking Facebook or whatever, right? About an issue that doesn't exist. Because if we take the assumptions that turn the national debt into an actual problem, or the debt ceiling into a real problem, which is, oh my God, we got to find the money in order to pay for this stuff, the argument turns into something like, from the right, they say, well, we shouldn't be financially irresponsible and spend money on things that we can't afford and to people who don't deserve it. Right? And what outflows from this is an example, something like, well, the government shouldn't forgive student loans because they took that loan on and they need to be responsible for their own actions. You get that argument over here on the right side, right? Like that's the left for the screen, but it's my right. On the left, we say, hey, who's controlling the resources? Right? You've got the system set up where that guy's got all the resources. We don't have any, so we need to do something so these resources are more equitable. And we don't really care about, we violated some principle or something because the principle's already being violated if I'm starving and you've got more to eat. You've got more than you need to eat. Right? Now, I think both sides are right on one sense and both sides are wrong in one sense, and here's why a large majority of this problem just dissolves once you understand you don't need the taxes to spend, and that the spending is necessary in order for the system to function. So if you don't need the taxes to spend and the spending is necessary in order to make the system function, the whole argument of where are we going to get the money to do that evaporates. It just completely evaporates. And we can stop fighting about it. We don't have to worry about the debt ceiling. And then the discussion can turn into, okay, we have to create the money in order for the system to function. So where is the best place to inject the money that we create? And I think once you accept that, if we take something like the student debt situation, and we say, okay, well, to address the rights problems with forgiving that debt, to say, okay, first of all, look, we told these people that they needed to take on this debt in order to succeed in society, and that was obviously a lie. And we've put the most productive members in our society into a permanent debt where they can't be productive in a way that supports a civilization. This is a really big problem, right? Well, if you understand that you're not creating any more money by forgiving that debt, the money's already been created. It's already out there. Okay, we can just forgive it. Whoop. And then this most important productive part of society can be more productive again and have their freedom back again, right? Instead of being debt slaves. And then the left can go, well, I guess that just gives the left what they want. But I think the point that the right does have is to say something to the effect of, okay, well, if these people are getting into debt for something that doesn't produce anything, maybe we need to go back and look at the system that's not producing anything, which is the school and the university system. So now we're having an actual discussion of real problems.
Right. I mean, I think it goes back to the job transition.
Ooh, get into that, Nima.
Program. Well, this is what you and I support as, okay, this is the one thing where by virtue of the design of the system, the government has a responsibility to provide the people a job if the people can't earn money to pay the taxes that the system demands of the private sector.
Right.
So if the government says we impose a tax in this money, like if we go back to my initial system, I'm imposing a tax on the conquered population, and I'm spending the money on my lackeys, my generals, and whatnot. The assumption is that I hire people, that I make this money available to people, so it can be paid back to me. If I don't do that, if I don't make enough money available, then I'm basically holding the private sector hostage. I mean, it's basically just turns to a bullying scheme. So what we think makes sense is for the government to provide a so-called federal transition job program, or some people call the job guarantee, where people, I mean, it could be made very decentralized, it could be grants made available by the federal government and then implemented on a community level, where people do things that are useful to the community, very simple things that it's easy to find workers for. And the wage paid in those jobs de facto becomes a sort of minimum wage. And this way, whenever there's an economic situation where people fall out of employment or whatever, this system could catch them and keep the system going without much of any shocks or crises ever having to occur, because you always have this constant
Employer of last resort, basically.
employer of last resort scheme. And this also provides for almost full employment at any given point. I mean, no involuntary unemployment could exist in that kind of system, basically. The only unemployment would be people who say, no, I don't want to do that federal transition job. Well, okay, then that's your choice.
Sit there and do nothing, yeah.
Yeah, that's your choice. There's no involuntary unemployment possible in that kind of system. And it basically is something that I think it would not be very inflationary. Actually, it would be paid to the lower earning sectors of society, so they could go out and consume. Companies can produce and earn an income from that. Hopefully, then hire those people out of that federal transition job sector pretty quickly. And this would also make sure, I mean, it would address so many problems in society. We could just go down the list: unemployment, drug addiction, domestic abuse, depression, crime. There's so many things that are scientifically proven, correlated with unemployment, that we could, I mean, it would be a different world. It would be hard to imagine. There's all kinds of things like ghetto slums and all this stuff would not necessarily have to exist, because people can always find some kind of a job. And so, yeah, that's what I think a federal transition job program would solve a lot of these problems very, very easily and very from the ground up.
And I wanted to emphasize one of the things that you brought up, which is the private sector being to hire out these people. So if we want to talk about a real invisible hand here, let's talk about this one. It's not really invisible because I'm going to describe it very specifically. Is that, let's say, just at a local level, some small town or some small city out somewhere in America, right? They, for whatever reason, come into economic hard times, whether it's national or local or something. And there's other factors that are part of this, but one of the biggest factors is the fact that there's not enough money to go around to pay for everything. So if a business owner, let's say a restaurant or a cafe, for example, is open, they say, well, we need to have a certain capacity met in order to pay our bills, right? And if we're at 50% capacity, we're selling, 50% of the cups of coffee that we can actually sell if we were working full time, then we're going to close. If we get 70, we're breaking even. If we hit 80 or more, we're making money, right? Well, if there's not enough money in the system for people to buy cups of coffee and it goes below that 70, then the place closes. And then those people become unemployed. Now, if there's this federal transition job to catch those people and say, okay, you're going to start working for $15 an hour, and where that $15 an hour comes from isn't within the local system. It gets injected from nowhere from the federal government, which increases the amount of money in the local system. So those people can say, hey, I got enough money to go buy a cup of coffee, right? And then because there's enough money in the system that people can continue to consume the goods and get the production above a certain level. Okay, we're back up to 70, we're breaking even, we're at 80, we're doing good, we're at 90. I need to hire some more people. Now I can afford to pay more money than the federal transition job to hire that guy out of the federal transition job, and then what happens? That money injection stops. So there's a natural balancing factor between the two that's local and that's there that is, like Nima pointed out, much, much more resistant to national, international, or big economic shocks, because there's that employer of last resort to catch things and to get the financial situation not only just going again, but to stop it from stopping completely.
Yeah, it makes full employment the objective, basically, and it's probably the least arbitrary objective you can set yourself. You could probably make a case as to why that's arbitrary too, but out of all the objectives that we claim to set for the federal government is probably the least arbitrary one you could come up with. Because, as I said, by the design of the fiat money system, there has to be full employment to make it work smoothly. Right?
Well, and then even logically, like we would even argue that this is a libertarian argument, right? If the government creates the problem, it has to provide the solution. Like if the government creates the problem of arresting you, it has to give you the right to a speedy trial and legal defense.
Right. It's that example, the classroom example that Warren Mosler gave, where he got a bunch of students sitting in front of him in the class, and he says, okay, I have a business card here. Anyone want to come work in the public sector here and clean up the classroom? No, nobody interested in my business cards. Well, what if I tell you that there's a guy with a 9mm at the door, and he won't let you leave unless you present one of these business cards? Now you want the business card. Now you're all unemployed. You all want this business card, but you don't have it. So now, okay, you're going to come here, clean up, whatever. Well, what if I don't give you the business card and I just have my guy at the door with a 9mm? Well, then I'm just holding you hostage, basically. Yeah. You know, that's what a government that seeks to balance its budgets or achieve achieve budget surpluses. That's what they're doing in effect, assuming balanced trade. Okay, because there's another way of acquiring net private savings in the private sector, and that would be through a current account surplus, aka an export surplus. But then at the end of the day, there has to be some other government deficit spending for your full employment in your country. So that's just to say that this is something that government, by creating the problem, they have to provide a solution, right? If I create unemployment by imposing a tax on you guys, I have to give you the money so you can pay the tax. I have to hire people so they can pay the taxes.
Absolutely. I wanted to look at a couple articles because obviously this big debt ceiling thing has exploded in the news, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, the debt ceiling!
We have a
Republicans!"
We have a question, real quick.
Oh, good.
Ronora. Something I was thinking about is the possibility that if the government can only issue so many bonds due to no raise in debt ceiling, but the demand is unchanged, would that drive down the rates on bonds? Yes, absolutely. That's what happens when during these periods where the debt ceiling debate, whenever this bullshit starts, it appears as though the government might run out of the ability to create treasuries. Then that's what happens, because they don't stop spending their money. They have made their budget decisions. They are creating money on the regular to fund their expenditures. And so what they're doing here is, when they are not allowed to issue new treasury securities, they still continue spending money into the system, but they're not soaking that money up through treasury issues. So what happens then is that money goes chasing for existing treasury securities, and that has the effect of driving the bond rates down. And I think that's also what we observe oftentimes during this kind of theater, is that and the banks start having excess reserves, by the way, which curtails their ability to make new loans. So that's another side effect of all of this debt ceiling and temporary stop of issuing new treasury securities. Basically, the banks' excess reserves swell up, which, due to their leverage ratio calculations, makes it harder for them to make new loans. And a lot of these excess reserves go chasing treasury securities, driving down the interests on treasury securities.
And she adds, also have to consider SLR regulations. I don't know what those are.
That's a supplementary leverage ratio. That's exactly, I think, what I was just talking about, which is when the excess reserves swell up on the bank's accounts, these reserves are counted as loans, as if they're the same as loans, even though they're absolutely safe and secure. They're never going to default on those, so they should not be counted as those. And actually, during the lockdowns during the 2020s, 2021s, for a period, they did ease up on those SLR regulations, but they're now, from what I understand, they're now back in full force. So stupid regulations are back in full force now. So as long as this kind of stuff goes on, and some banks might run into problems if they hit their leverage ratio maximums or minimums or however it's calculated, they might run into trouble making plain routine loans that they would have otherwise made.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try sharing my screen here again just to see if it works. I've had problems sharing my screen in the past, and maybe it's going to work this time. Let's see. Nope. It just froze the screen up. All right. I'll unshare this. So I wanted to look at a couple articles that I found, not because they're necessarily interesting, but the noise that gets created. I wanted to show examples of these arguments going back and forth and this craziness going back and forth about issues that just don't fucking exist. So I've got this article pulled up from this is the War Room from Steve Bannon. And I guess he had this guy named David Bratt, who's the it's a funny last name, David Bratt, and he's the dean at the Liberty University School of Business. And the title of the article here is Dave Bratt on the United States debt ceiling. Everybody knows we're going to default. Ah! Right? First of all, the only reason for default, as we just pointed out, it would be a political decision. It has nothing to do with, oh, we ran out of money, or, oh, my God, the finances don't work out, or we didn't tax enough. We didn't buy. It's just all entirely nonsense. And if you scroll down a little bit, Nima, he then, not going to watch the video. Scroll back up so I can read the text there a little bit. Yeah, they're good. So just to, there's a little blurb here about what's in the video. Is it says Dave Bratt, former congressman and professor of business and economics, talks to host Steve Bannon about the financial crisis. Big term there. Financial crisis caused by out-of-control federal spending. More emotionally loaded words. And he quotes David Bratt saying, the left is supposed to have feelings and care about children. Every kid is $125,000 in debt when they're born. Every worker is $250,000 in debt right now. And they're talking about a financial crisis? Hell, folks, we are there. Okay, you see this? Left and, hey, left, let's fight about this. Nobody's in debt.
Well,
there's nobody in debt.
Right. So every worker has $250,000 in savings right now.
Yeah, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite, right? It's not that they owe. It's that this money is sitting on bank accounts in the country. And yes, the U.S. there's a lot of income discrepancies in the U.S. So a lot of this money obviously is sitting in rich people's bank accounts. But if you want to play this game of divvying it up throughout the entire population, then it's the private sector's net savings that constitutes the total debt. It's not their debt.
Right. So this is a perfect example of fist fighty, annoying bullshit that simply is not an issue, that doesn't exist, that we could stop fighting about. Let me move on to another article. This is from Russia Today, RT.com, that U.S. warned of default. The Treasury Secretary says a debt limit hike is badly needed. Now, this one's interesting because this is all technically true. The U.S. is expected to reach a statutory debt ceiling next week, which could see the country defaulting on its obligations unless preventative steps are taken. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned on Friday in a letter to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. This is in quotes from the letter, once the limit is reached, Treasury will need to start taking certain extraordinary measures to prevent the United States from defaulting on its obligations, Yellen wrote. She noted, however, that these measures will only go as far as to give Congress time to negotiate and pass a debt limit hike, most likely until early June. So here's what's insidious about this article is that it's technically true, right? Is that the Federal Reserve, because it's completely beholden to Congress, and the laws of Congress can only act within the sphere that Congress allows it to. And if Congress arbitrarily says there's a debt ceiling, then the Federal Reserve, or excuse me, the Treasury Secretary has got a problem on her hands, right? Because she's got to work within the realm that's given to her. And then we hear this, Treasury will need to start taking certain extraordinary measures to prevent the United States from defaulting on its own obligations. Well, it's not a default, right? It's just, I mean, is it default if I have the money and I just decide not to make my payment? Is that default?
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be the only possible way to default, was to choose to not pay the money, not for any reasons of ability to pay or whatever, but they would just choose to stop paying.
Right.
That's the only way the U.S. could ever default on its debt, quote unquote.
Right. So here's another perfect example of a bullshit problem that's not real. I mean, the government makes it real because they act like it's real, and they have these big arguments and jump up and down, and the Republicans are in charge, and we're going to debt ceiling, the Biden, we're not going to let the Republicans ruin the. It's all horseshit. They can just stop arguing about this. I've got another one from Zero Hedge here. Debt ceiling battle to test GOP resolve under McCarthy. This week, the United States Treasury activated so-called extraordinary measures after the U.S. hit the debt ceiling. This is referring to similar stuff that the previous articles were talking about. He talks about Tyler Durden here talks about Janet Yellen saying a similar thing to what we just read, and then he goes on to say, now newly minted House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican from California, who made a boatload of concessions to GOP holdouts in exchange for the votes, has been pressing Democrats to come to the bargaining table. Democrats, meanwhile, have been giving McCarthy the cold shoulder and have characterized several ideas from the Republicans as non-starters, the Hill reports. Republicans are creating a crisis that need not exist. I agree with Representative Brendan Boyle, Democrat from Pennsylvania, on this. Top Democrat of the House Budget Committee is accusing the GOP of playing political games. The impasse has heightened public concern in recent days, particularly as a Treasury Department has begun what it calls, in quotes, extraordinary measures to keep the U.S. government from defaulting on its debt. The standoff comes as House Republicans have ramped up calls to tie spending cuts to any bill raising or suspending the debt limit. So I completely agree with this Democrat saying the Republicans are creating a crisis that need not exist. Now, not that the Democrats don't do it as well when they're the minority in power, right? But
Right.
This whole debt ceiling thing, it's just political theater that one side can use to leverage the other side. And, I don't know how many of these members actually understand any of this stuff or not. But I think they do understand, at the very least, that the debt ceiling can always be used as a public awareness tool where they could rile up the public about the debt ceiling in order to try to bring something to the negotiating table.
Well, Nora just pointed out here, they are basically, by silent omission, admitting it's a matter of process and not economics.
Boom. Nice, Rowanora. Good synopsis there.
I mean, the whole thing just makes more sense if you understand that what I've come to believe at this point is that the whole government just exists to create drama and fighting, to create topics for people to get excited about and argue over nothing, basically, for an extended period of time. It's basically just fighting from one crisis into another, right?
Right. Well, and then we got Ron Paul coming up next year. Are you ready to make fun of Ron Paul, Nima?
Yeah.
So we got Ron Paul here on InfoWars, writing an article. I don't know for InfoWars, if InfoWars is just posting it from wherever he writes. So this is written by Ron Paul. This week, the U.S. government reached its $31.4 trillion borrowing limit. Oh, the borrowing limit. We already know that's fake. issue, better known as the debt ceiling. This led to a showdown among House Republicans, President Biden, and the congressional Democrats. House Republicans are demanding that President Biden and Senate Democrats agree to include spending cuts with the debt ceiling increases. However, President Biden and the congressional Democrats are refusing to negotiate with Republicans. Rather, that they and their allies in the mainstream media are lambasting Republicans for their irresponsibility in seeking to include spending cuts with an increase in the debt ceiling. Ron Paul goes on to say, America's national debt is approximately 122% of the gross domestic product, meaning the government owes more than the population can produce, Nima. Interest payments on the national debt follow in size behind other federal budget big spending areas of Social Security, Medicare, and defense. How are we going to pay for all this interest, Nima? How are we going to do it?
Yeah, we wouldn't have to. I mean, we could just issue zero interest bonds if that's the problem. But they never discuss that, So.
Well, and here's another fake issue, right? We're spending a certain percentage of the gross domestic product. Oh my God, who cares? Japan's been at like 250% for freaking decades, and they still can't get their economy kickstarted. And the reason is they're working with bullshit ideas.
Right. There was a book that came out a couple of years ago at this point where they've concluded that once you hit the 90% debt to GDP, then you're just on your
way out.
Yeah, it's like no turning back from that. But there have been MMT economists who have analyzed that book and analyzed the premises, and they found out that they were completely commingling foreign indebtedness with
Local,
with
national,
indebtedness in a local currency, because in those latter cases, it's absolutely not the case that it has to lead to a sovereign default, as you just mentioned. Japan has something like 300% of GDP in national debt at this point, and it hasn't led to any kind of national default or whatever.
Right. So, I mean, this is just another perfect example of let's argue about something that doesn't fucking matter. Roa Nora has written some more here. But what if the Dems, due to political pressure from inflation, and whatnot go along with it? More of a chance for this to happen than any other point in my lifetime, I think. Yeah, I mean, to this point, and she, I presume she, just due to political machinations. That's exactly the point. This is entirely a political process. This is like nothing to do with finance, nothing to do with economics. This is pure political decisions. And and what we're saying is that they're basing these political decisions and political arguments on issues that are fake and don't exist.
Well, it goes back to what I said last time. It's always they create these figures and these numbers that they expect everyone to care about, or they tell you here's the new number that you have to care about now. And it's never really explained why or what's behind and what's the reasons for that. It's the same that they do with the global temperature. They declare, this is the global temperature that we are allowed, or this is the global temperature increase that's allowed. Anything beyond that is disaster. Anything below that is good. We've achieved something good. Here's the 7 or 8 incidents of positive COVID PCR tests that we have to achieve this week or whatever. And if we achieve that, we're good. If not, we're bad. And it goes on and on. They create all these stupid ass metrics and numbers, and people just assume that they mean something. And it's really not. They don't mean what we think they mean, or what we're told they mean. They are just tools to achieve ulterior objectives that we're not even really aware of what's going on here. Population control, ordering the population around, achieving financial objectives, achieving whatever political objectives, but they have nothing to do with the metrics and numbers that they present to us.
I have a silly analogy that I think might help the understanding of this situation. when I was in high school, actually, when I was in middle school, I started taking Japanese classes, and when I got to high school, freshman year, I was able to take second year Japanese, even though I was a freshman. And they had a new Japanese teacher this year, and so the sophomores and older students had a different Japanese teacher the previous year at the high school, and apparently this Japanese teacher had no ability whatsoever to control the students, and so the students had convinced this teacher. So this is back when we still had overhead projectors, right? Did you have those in Germany, Nima? Overhead projectors when you were going to school? Okay, yeah. So we had the overhead projector. So every day, the students would get in there early, and then the teacher would come in, and there'd be one student that sat by the outlet next to the wall and unplugged the overhead projector, and the teacher didn't see it. And they had convinced the teacher that in order to get the overhead projector to work, because obviously she's hitting the button, it's not coming on, that she had to walk around it 3 times and blow into the fan to kickstart it. And when she did that, they'd plug in the projector and she'd hit the button and it'd work, right? So here's the question. In order to turn on that projector, do you have to walk around it 3 times and blow into the fan to kickstart it? Well, obviously no, but in this case, yes. Because the students made this fake shit up and controlled the situation that made it real, right?
Well, and it's even worse. So with the kinds of scams that the globalist governments run on their people, there's not even a beneficial effect to the things. They ask people to wear masks. They ask people to get experimental risky gene drug injections. They ask people to do all kinds of shit that supposedly does something.
You need carbon taxes to change the weather. Yes.
So the weather changes. You need to have the interest rates need to go up so we stop inflation, but then the inflation doesn't stop. You never see any of the things that they claim that their measures do. You never actually see any of those materialize. And at that point, it doesn't even matter anymore to them. It's like, oh, well, we've done it now and we're going to continue doing it. We don't need any evidence for it because the theory is all there is, and it's never questioned. It's operating procedure. They hate us. Yeah, they do.
Yep, I think that's an accurate statement. Yes.
They absolutely have nothing but contempt for the common man, for the population.
And then to that point, they hate us so much, and one of the greatest ways that they get us not to be able to organize is get us to fight each other over fucking nothing.
Exactly.
That's the conversation we're trying to have here, is that, okay, I mean, not that there wouldn't be stuff for the left and right to fight over if we got this economics issue figured out, but this isn't something that we need to fight over. This is all fake stuff. And on that point, I want to do one more article before I stop criticizing these articles. So this is from Zero Hedge, blank check, Democrats want to totally eliminate the debt ceiling with a new bill. So, again, this is from Tyler Durden. I wonder who this guy actually is at Zero Hedge.
Brad Pitt, of course.
So, a group of 43 Democrats want to completely eliminate the debt ceiling. Oh, my God. Which they say Republicans have weaponized, which would give the government a blank check to borrow without any limit from Congress. Again, I agree with the Democrats here. The Republicans are weaponizing it. And again, no other country on earth has a fucking debt ceiling.
It's not true that there would be no limits from Congress, because Congress makes the bills that allow the government to spend to begin with.
Right.
So that is supposed to be the checks and balances from Congress upon the Treasury, upon the government, not the debt ceiling. Coincidentally, the debt ceiling never ends up being any kind of check and balance because they just raise it. So the checks and balances are supposed to happen during the budget negotiations. That's when it matters, not when the decisions have already been made.
Yeah, and then to your point, they just lift the debt ceiling whenever they feel like it, so there actually isn't a debt ceiling, so that's more proof that this is arguing about nothing. Right? So yes. the end the Threat of Default Act, introduced by Representative Bill Foster, a Democrat from Illinois, and co-sponsored by 42 House Democrats, comes after the federal government hit 31,000 trillion. I don't think this guy could do math. 31, or he's using a comma instead of a decimal. 31 trillion debt ceiling last week. According to the Democrats, instead of attempting to responsibly spend taxpayer dollars through negotiations, it's time to just eliminate all limits on federal borrowing. Again, here, I mean, just another thing. Okay, in some sense, yes, it's taxpayer dollars because we pay taxes and the government spends it into existence, and therefore it's our dollars. But what he's getting at here is that there's a limit to the amount of taxes that can be brought in, therefore there's a limit of spending, which we've already talked about, isn't a thing. That's not a thing. This is another fake thing to fight about. I mean, this goes on, and I mean, I can further criticize it, but that's just, I mean, I don't, that's enough of that. It's just another example of, the whole news sphere gets inflated with this shit that's fake to get us fighting over issues that don't exist. So please, let's learn some MMT. And let me say this too. Like, okay, maybe MMT isn't 100% accurate. And, the more that we look at people like, Colin Roche or Professor Richard Werner, where there's these different economic areas that these different people are approaching the system from, and they're not necessarily MMT people, but they're recognizing that the money gets created from nowhere. They're recognizing that the money gets created from nowhere, and then that has implications different from the neoclassical understanding, which is, we got to tax it in order to spend it because of the barter theory of money. Blah. Right?
Yeah, I think it's a good basis of understanding. Doesn't mean it's perfect. No theory is perfect, but I think it's definitely much better than a lot of the common theories that are circulating these days.
So, again, going back to the Tim Pool thing, right? Matt Gaetz comes on and just again the number of assumptions that are incorrect that have to be taken for granted in order for that conversation to even happen and make sense. I mean, it's just turtle upon turtle upon turtle upon turtle going all the way down. I mean, if you understand what we understand, you can't even have that conversation because it doesn't even make sense. So, if for some reason somebody from Tim Pool sees this, we want to come on Tim Pool to explain this stuff. We're more than happy to have whoever you want on the show grill our asses. Get Adam Schiff on there for all we care. No. Yeah, Adam Schiff. Yeah, I convinced Peter Schiff. That's what I meant to say. Adam Schiff's the fucking mannequin-looking dude from Congress, right? I confused Peter Schiff and Adam Schiff. Peter Schiff is who I meant to say. Have Peter Schiff on there for all we care. We'll happily wrestle with him.
We have a new comment. Have you guys ever heard of Jehu, the gold bug Marxist? He says MMT is technically correct, but not true.
I want to know what semantic Scott Adams bullshit he uses to say a sentence like that.
But I haven't heard of him, but I'd be interested in hearing that.
It's technically correct, but not true. The gold bug Marxist. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about him. Anyway, so I think we've beaten this horse to death, and we'll continue to beat it to death in the future. I wanted to rebeat it to death just because it's just all this noise taking up your brain that's for nothing, that you need to understand that this is for nothing, and you can just fucking ignore it. Right? Was there any other point that you wanted to make, Nima, before we wrap this up?
Well, there was one thing that came up in that conversation that you just posted on Tim Pool, which is, is this just going to keep on increasing, and is this going to keep on rising and rising for eternity, right? And I think it's a valid question to ask. Why is that the case? Why does
it have to go up?
Why does it have to continue to go up? Why? But then that goes back to, why does economic growth have to continue rising and rising, right?
Right.
So I was wondering if it might be helpful to look at Carol Quigley's introduction on...
We talk about Carol Quigley so much, Nima, I just leave the book right here on the table. I don't even put it back on the shelf.
Well, this is from Tragedy and Hope,
right,
where he talks about, the surplus and how the Western economy is based on growth. And if the growth stops, the whole system collapses. It's not just that less gets produced or whatever, but the whole system collapses.
No, I think he mentions that in the Evolution of Civilizations too. What she essentially says is that nobody has ever considered a stable society that doesn't require growth.
Well, that's Tragedy and Hope. I can read it right here.
Okay, well, it must be in both then.
Yeah, it could be. An economic system does not have to be expansive, that is, constantly increasing its production of wealth. And it might well be possible for people to be completely happy in a non-expansive economic system if they were accustomed to it. In the 20th century, however, the people of our culture have been living under expansive conditions for generations. Their minds are psychologically adjusted to expansion, and they feel deeply frustrated unless they are better off each year than they were the preceding year. The economic system itself has become organized for expansion, and if it does not expand, it tends to collapse. The basic reason for this maladjustment is that investment has become an essential part of the system, and if investment falls off, consumers have insufficient incomes to buy the consumer's goods which are being produced in another part of the system, because part of the flow of purchasing power created by the production of goods was diverted from purchasing the goods it had produced into savings, and all the goods produced could not be sold until those savings came back into the market by being invested. In the system as a whole, everyone sought to improve his own position in the short run, but this jeopardized the functioning of the system in the long run. The contrast here is not merely between the individual and the system, but also between the long run and the short run. So basically, if you produce, if your economy gets to a point where you're producing surpluses, then the question is, who buys those surpluses? If you're just producing surpluses and they ended up not being in any demand and just end up dumped and rotting,
then you go out of business.
Then you go out of business, or at least your business doesn't grow, right? I mean, you've produced a bunch of stuff, but all the training that went into it, all the expansion of your productive capacity, turns out it was for nothing, and the stuff just ends up rotting. So how do you make sure you have consumers who earn money to buy the excess product? Well, you invest in a new machinery of some type. You hire people to build new machinery, and you pay those people, and then those people now have money that they can use to buy the excess that has already been produced. And then now the machinery that they've produced in and of itself becomes an efficiency improvement, and you generate more surpluses. And so you keep going and going in that kind of economy. But I think that's basically what Carol Quigley laid out there, that we have become accustomed to expansion. The whole system is based on it. You know, a lot of us hold stocks in our portfolio. The value of stocks is based on the assumption that those companies will continue producing and selling in the future.
And selling more, growing.
Selling more in the future, right. So the economy has to keep on growing to facilitate everyone's expectations. And so if that's the case, that means that there has to be more and more borrowing to finance more and more projects. But then, in order for that borrowing to remain solid on a solid footing, the federal government has to expand its deficit, or some federal government has to. If you have export,
there has to be enough private sector net savings in order to.
So this has to grow along with the overall economic growth.
Yeah,
doesn't mean that it just grows as some absolute figure or number. But within the context of overall economic growth, your government budget will also continue growing accordingly.
Yeah, well, what he just points out there is interesting, that in order for the economy to have enough money to buy the goods that it produces, that money comes from investment, which produces more goods and services. And is there a system where could we design a system where all the goods and services could still be consumed without the consumer having to rely on money that's earned from investment? Do you think I understood that correctly?
Yeah, it would be possible if You replace the investment with just pure government deficit spending, for example.
Yes.
That's
For
one
like a
possibility.
federal transition job, like we said, that injects the money from the bottom up as opposed to hitting the investment, and everybody has to go work at that,
Right.
building that factory or whatever in order to get the investment money to pay for the goods.
But then it's a question: do you want to have more worker output per labor unit? Well, then you have to keep investing in your economy. You have to have private sector investment. Another possibility would be through export surpluses. But then again, you're treading water. You're not building up technically, I would say the best thing you can do is build up your own country's capital stock, build up your own country's stock of machinery, computers, training, etc. All the things that you do to improve the output per worker unit.
Well, yeah, and then, I mean, even with the trade surplus, it's kind of circumventing the issue because somebody is buying those goods, and they've got that money from investment because that's how all the systems are set up in the world.
Well, there are countries that rely on that when they are in early stages, primitive economies. They do kind of rely on that, and many of them get stuck in that cycle. 'Cause
Correct.
now all they do is they export the things that they build and import food and stuff that that they need to feed their own people.
Which is honestly a
But-
national security issue for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Independence, but you're not growing your own economy's capital stock, and so you're not really improving the wealth of your economy, or you're kind of treading water in that scenario.
I concur. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating conversation to say, okay, this is the way that the system is set up, and we've been talking about the way that the system is set up, but we haven't critiqued should it be set up that way.
Right. So
Yeah.
because is it possible to just have an economy that's circular, that always stays the same? Yeah, it would be a pastoral, more simplistic life altogether, right? We all live on the land.
But is that what we want?
Right, so we want, right?
Cool. I'm gonna end it, Nima, unless you got something totally
That
enlightening to add to the end here. Cool. So
play us out.
I'll play us out again. Tim Pool, have us on. Let's argue about this. You can find our stuff at Irida.tv. Thank you for listening to this. I mean, we'll just keep jumping up and down, harping on the same chord, going, we could have a completely different, much better, productive conversation if we just get a couple economic facts straight. It's just completely different, and it feels so much better. You could stop worrying about the sky is about to fall, whether you're on the left or on the right. I mean, it's so relieving emotionally to be an MMT guy. So yeah, head on over to Irida TV. Please like, share, subscribe, especially share, because we ask you for $0 on the show. How much money do we ask everybody for, Nima? Zero. Nothing. We ask you for nothing. We're probably the one show that you listen to that isn't constantly fucking begging you for money or advertising something. So the least you can do to help us is share us around if you like what you're hearing and you think other people should hear it. And we would really appreciate that. So this has been Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irida TV. We've been doing it live. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.